Once they are a valuable asset, they rose to power with America's backing, celebrated as key allies, only to be abandoned, betrayed, and, in some cases, eliminated when they were no longer useful. From secret CIA deals to political assassinations, history has shown that loyalty means little in the ruthless game of global power. From Manuel Noriega to Diem to Saddam Hussein, and now to Volodymyr Zelensky. Who were these powerful figures? Why did the United States use and later turn against them? First, we uncover the rise and fall of Diem, the controversial leader of South Vietnam. Vietnam, once a French colony, became a Cold War battleground after World War II. The country was divided in 1954, Communist North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh and anti-communist South Vietnam under Dinh Diem. The United States saw Diem as the perfect leader to prevent the spread of communism. But how did he go from being Washington's chosen ally to a man overthrown and assassinated? America's involvement in Vietnam was shaped by the domino theory, the belief that if one country fell to communism, others would follow. To stop this, the U.S. needed a strong anti-communist leader in South Vietnam. Enter Dinh Diem. Diem, a Catholic ruling over a Buddhist-majority country, was backed by the U.S. with military and economic aid. He promised stability and a pro-Western government, but his rule soon became authoritarian, marked by corruption, nepotism, and brutal crackdowns on dissent. The tipping point came in 1963. Diem's government suppressed Buddhist protests with deadly force, sparking outrage. Images of Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire spread worldwide, damaging both Diem's reputation and America's moral standing. Behind the scenes, Washington grew frustrated. The U.S. had invested in Diem, but his inability to control the crisis made him a liability. By late 1963, American officials, including Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., were in contact with South Vietnamese generals plotting a coup. On November 1, 1963, the coup was launched. Diem and his brother Nhu were captured and executed the next day. Then we confront the complex legacy of Saddam Hussein, a dictator propped up by U.S. support, only to become one of its most wanted. We'll hear insights from one of today's most controversial journalists, shedding light on these intertwined narratives.
Did you know that the United States supported Saddam Hussein? Here he is shaking hands with former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. After the 1979 Iranian Revolution against the US-backed Shah, the US was looking for allies in the region who they could use as proxies to attack Iran. This made Saddam Hussein a perfect ally for the West, and he invaded Iran in 1980. The invasion was brutal, and hundreds of thousands of Iranians would be killed in the fighting. Saddam would use chemical weapons given to him by the West, both against Iranians and the Kurds. Which is ironic considering the US has accused other countries of using chemical gas and launched missiles at them because of it. In 1988, the US would directly involve themselves after gunning down Iranian Flight 655. This was a commercial airliner going from Tehran to Dubai, and 290 civilians were killed in the incident. The gunboat captain who shot it down was then given an award by President George H.W. Bush. The US also began training up Saddam Hussein's nuclear scientists. And fearing more escalations from the US, Iran negotiated a ceasefire in 1988. Then just 2 years later, Saddam would invade Kuwait, thinking that he had the green light from the US. After all, they were boys. He quickly realized that he had made a mistake and angered the US, so he tried to negotiate a settlement for almost 9 months. This was ignored by the American press, but in reality, Saddam was asking for next to nothing. He said that he would leave Kuwait if the US put the Palestinian question higher on their agenda. However, the US ignored this and used the invasion of Kuwait as justification to bomb Iraq to a pre-industrial, near-apocalyptic state. They also lied to the American public, claiming that Iraqi soldiers were taking babies out of incubators and leaving them on the floor to die. US President Bill Clinton would follow up the bombing campaign by placing sanctions on Iraq, which starved 500,000 Iraqi children to death. His Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, would later say that this was worth it on 60 Minutes. Then, of course, the US would invade and occupy Iraq in 2003 using 9/11 as justification, even though Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. And it just goes to show how the Western imperialists will use people like pawns and then throw them in the trash when they no longer need them. And the people who really suffer from this are the working masses who fight these wars on behalf of the rich. So many people had to die so that the US could control the oil reserves and other valuable resources in the Middle East.
Next, we explore Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian strongman who danced with the CIA before becoming a target of their wrath. Noriega was the ruler in Panama during the 1980s. He became ruler after another leader died in a plane crash, Omar Torrijos.
Ejercía una gran influencia en toda América.
Noriega basically rose from that into power and seized more and more power. He had ostentatious mansions, exotic pets. He is known to have had a real fondness for whiskey, late night parties with women, the life that, you might recognize from a drug capo.
There were signs that his connections to the cartels were getting stronger, which made many people in Washington very uneasy. To have basically a drug dealer as the head of a country so important to the US interests?
He was, for many years, on the payroll of the CIA. He really kind of played both sides, which the United States, I think, for a time was okay with, but Noriega evolved more and more into a brutal dictator who is increasingly defiant to the U.S.
Esperaremos sentados en la ribera del canal a ver el cadáver de nuestro enemigo pasar.
He was targeting dissidents, cracking down on opposition in a very brutal, bloody way.
Noriega inició una ola de brutal represión atacando a los manifestantes y encarcelando a cientos de sus adversarios.
There were signs that his ties to the cartels were growing ever stronger. That made a lot of people in Washington very nervous to have essentially a drug trafficker as the leader of a nation so vital to the U.S. geopolitical interests.
The triggering event was a clash in December 1989 when Panamanian soldiers shot and killed an unarmed American soldier, injured another, and arrested and beat a third, and threatened his wife. At that moment, the Bush administration said, "Enough is enough," and they ordered the capture of Noriega.
As president, I have no higher obligation than to safeguard the lives of American citizens. And that is why I directed our armed forces to protect the lives of American citizens in Panama and to bring General Noriega to justice in the United States.
You have the strongest country on earth against the Panama Defense Forces, so you can kind of guess how that went. It was a very brief invasion. He wasn't. Noriega was a pretty slippery and hard-to-catch guy. He managed to escape and end up in the Vatican embassy for a while. Eventually, he did give up to U.S. forces and was flown to Miami. He faced trial on the drug charges and was sentenced to 40 years. He served 17 before being sent to a prison term in France, and then to another in Panama before dying in 2017. And finally, we analyzed the modern enigma of Volodymyr Zelensky, a leader hailed as a hero.
Not just inspire us, but inspire the world with their courage and how they have chose the resilience and resolve for their future.
At first, they called him a hero. Now, they call him a dictator.
But think of it, a modestly successful comedian, a dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast because that war is going in the wrong direction. In the meantime, we're successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia.
When Russia invaded, the United States stood with Ukraine. They sent billions in aid, weapons, and intelligence. They called Zelensky the defender of democracy, the leader of a righteous cause. He stood before Congress. They cheered. He shook hands with U.S. presidents. They promised support for as long as it takes. But war is expensive, and in politics, loyalty comes with limits. As time passed, priorities changed. The aid slowed. The conditions increased. Zelensky wasn't just fighting Russia, he was now fighting for Washington's attention. And then, the deals began. A proposal was put on the table, military aid in exchange for Ukraine's rare earth minerals. The U.S. wanted access to critical resources, minerals essential for weapons, energy, and technology. At first, they demanded half of Ukraine's oil and mineral wealth. Zelensky resisted, so they revised the deal. 50% of the revenue from Ukraine's minerals would go to the U.S. But there was a catch. Security guarantees were off the table. Ukraine would get money, but no promises of future protection. No guarantees that, when the next battle came, the U.S. would stand by its side. And then came the words no one expected. Behind closed doors, pressure grew. Washington spoke of peace talks. Some called for restraint. Others questioned if Ukraine was still worth the cost. Zelensky still fights, but the world that once stood behind him is now looking away. Was it ever about democracy, or was it always about control? Betrayal in geopolitics is never sudden. It happens slowly, deal by deal, hesitation by hesitation, silence by silence.
What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly what you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country, that's backed you far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No.